Hi guys! From the moment he was born, a boy from a samurai family found himself in a special position, though he did not feel extraordinary, because everything that happened to him was seen as part of the natural order, something that simply was. His arrival into the world was not marked by grand celebrations or feasts, as it sometimes was in other cultures, where the birth of an heir could become an occasion for loud festivities. In a samurai household, things were quiet and modest, yet every gesture, every action carried deep meaning and symbolic weight, as if from the very first hours of life, the boy was already stepping onto a path that all members of his class were expected to follow. He was given a name, not just a pleasant-sounding one, but one that carried an idea: endurance, loyalty, inner strength, or righteousness. This name became a kind of reminder of who he was meant to become, as though a lifelong program was being laid within him from the very beginning, a program that allowed no room for weakness, doubt, or self-indulgent searching. Near the infant, despite his helplessness and smallness, a short sword, the wakizashi, was often placed, not for him to play with, but so that this object, which would later become a symbol of honor and the warrior's soul, was part of his world from the start. It was not merely a blade, but a promise of the future, a constant reminder of a destiny that could not be ignored. Over time, the boy grew accustomed to its presence, and when he one day first held a wooden training sword in his hands, it did not feel new or frightening, but rather like a continuation of something that had always been with him. By the age of 3, he was already being taught things that in other cultures would have been considered inappropriate for a child: to sit still, to breathe evenly, to stay focused, not to react to fear. He would be seated on a mat, eyes closed, listening to the rustle of the wind or the silence of the room, and if he opened his eyes too soon, trembled, or lost concentration, he would be asked to begin again, sometimes again and again, until he learned to maintain a state of calm. This was not cruelty in the usual sense, but rather preparation for a life in which emotions could not be allowed to run wild, where every movement, every action had to be deliberate, and fear was not an excuse to flee, but a challenge to be overcome. If he fell or was frightened, he was not comforted, but reminded that a samurai must not show weakness, even if he felt afraid inside, because weakness was not merely a personal flaw, it was a risk to the family, to the lord, to the entire order he would one day be sworn to protect. By the age of 5, physical and spiritual exercises were joined by lessons in writing and reading. He learned to write kanji, not merely as a skill, but choosing those characters associated with duty, patience, and honor, and each time he formed a symbol, he was not just training his hand, but absorbing its meaning, as though each stroke reinforced a certain quality within him. He was given not fairy tales or legends of heroes to read, but serious texts, the teachings of Confucius, Buddhist parables, the codes of conduct for samurai, and he listened to how important it was to be loyal to his lord, to respect his elders, to understand that the family's honor was more valuable than his own life. These were not abstract ideas spoken in passing, but part of daily life, part of what he heard every day, as though repetition made them a part of himself. Girls from samurai families lived in a similarly strict atmosphere, though their path was different. They were not trained to fight alongside their brothers, but they were expected to handle a knife, to know how to manage a household, raise children, and uphold the family's honor. They too were taught discipline, modesty, and self-control, and if enemies ever broke into the home, they were to either defend themselves or commit seppuku, to avoid capture and bring no shame to their husband or father. For them, as for the men, honor was not just a word, but the highest value, one that could not be betrayed. By the age of 7, the boy was formally sent to study, and from that point on, his life became even more structured and demanding. He began to learn martial arts, bujei, not only swordsmanship, which received special attention, but also archery, spear fighting, horsemanship, and the study of military treatises that explored strategy, tactics, and the moral dilemmas of the warrior. At the same time, he was not deprived of other skills considered essential for a cultivated person. He learned to write poetry, especially haiku about nature and fleeting moments of existence. He practiced calligraphy and took part in the tea ceremony, where every movement was carefully considered and where the focus was not on the tea itself, but on the state of mind, concentration, and respect for the guest. A samurai could not be merely strong, he had to be composed, intelligent, cultured, capable of silence when needed, and speech only when truly necessary. At the same time, in Europe, a boy from a feudal family also began his training, but it was arranged differently. He was sent to another lord's castle to serve as a page, cleaning armor, carrying wine, learning dances, music, and courtly manners, and he was raised to become a future knight, a man of the court, able to fight and charm ladies alike. Their courage and loyalty were valued, but so too was the ability to be gallant, elegant, and noticeable. He was taught not just to fight, but to be a hero whose deeds would be sung in poems. In Japan, however, the hero did not seek glory, he sought not to fail, not to bring shame, to fulfill his duty even if no one ever saw it. So the samurai's path began, not with loud words or grand deeds, but with quiet, almost invisible steps, discipline, the ability to sit, to be silent, to breathe, to write characters, to train again and again until each movement became perfect. It was not inspiration, but shaping, not a desire for fame, but readiness to serve, to face death, to live a life in which every day he had to remember, you are not just a person, you are a bearer of duty, and that duty is more important than anything. When the boy turned 7, the next stage of his life began, a period of systematic training designed not merely to make him a warrior, but a man capable of serving his lord in every sense. He was placed under the care of a teacher, often a former samurai known for discipline and skill, and from that moment, each day became part of a strict, almost monastic routine. Mornings began long before sunrise, with meditation, light exercise, and the cleansing of both body and mind. He was expected to rise with the first light, without complaint, without delay. This was not simply a habit, but the cultivation of willpower, the ability to command the body through the mind. After the morning exercises came lessons. He learned swordsmanship, not for the sake of winning duels, but for the perfection of movement, for inner balance. Every cut, every step, every stance was repeated hundreds of times until it became as natural as breathing. The teacher did not praise success, but pointed out errors with firmness, and the boy understood praise was a weakness, while correction was the path to mastery. He was not only learning to strike, but to feel how the sword became an extension of his arm, how blade and man merged into one. Alongside this, he trained in other martial arts, archery, spear fighting, and unarmed defense. He practiced in full armor, in heat and cold, on slippery ground, in the rain, so that he would grow accustomed to any condition. He was not shielded from hardship, on the contrary, it was deliberately introduced to test how ready he was for real life. If he fell, he got up alone. If he grew tired, he continued. If he wanted to give up, he was reminded that a samurai had no right to weakness. Yet he was not deprived of other aspects of education. He learned to read and write, studied classical Chinese texts, and examined military treatises such as Sun Tzu's The Art of War, learning not only how to fight, but how to think. He was taught strategy, logic, and how to anticipate an opponent's actions. He wrote essays on honor, duty, and the nature of authority, and these were judged not by elegance of style, but by depth of understanding. Eloquence was valued, but only if it came from sincerity. He also studied arts that, at first glance, might seem far removed from war. He learned calligraphy, where every stroke had to be precise, calm, and meaningful. He participated in the tea ceremony, in which every movement was refined to perfection, and where the focus was not on the pleasure of the drink, but on the state of mind, respect for the guest, and the ability to be fully present. He wrote haiku, short poems about nature, fleeting moments, and death, and in them, he learned to see beauty in the simple, the transient, the impermanent. In Europe at the same time, a boy from a feudal family was learning to be noticeable, charming, skilled in conversation. He was valued not only for bravery, but for his ability to please. He might be rough, but if he could speak beautifully of love or recount a heroic deed, he was forgiven. In Japan, however, outward elegance only mattered if there was inner order. The beauty of a movement was important, but only if it came from discipline, not from a desire to impress. So the years passed, one day after another, exercise after exercise, mistake after mistake, until the boy gradually became what he was meant to be, not merely a master of the sword, but a man in whom strength, intellect, and spirit were in balance. When the boy turned 7, the next stage of his life began, a period of systematic training designed not merely to make him a warrior, but a man capable of serving his lord in every sense. He was placed under the care of a teacher, often a former samurai known for discipline and skill, and from that moment, each day became part of a strict, almost monastic routine. Mornings began long before sunrise, with meditation, light exercise, and the cleansing of both body and mind. He was expected to rise with the first light, without complaint, without delay. This was not simply a habit, but the cultivation of willpower, the ability to command the body through the mind. After the morning exercises came lessons. He learned swordsmanship, not for the sake of winning duels, but for the perfection of movement, for inner balance. Every cut, every step, every stance was repeated hundreds of times until it became as natural as breathing. The teacher did not praise success, but pointed out errors with firmness, and the boy understood praise was a weakness, while correction was the path to mastery. He was not only learning to strike, but to feel how the sword became an extension of his arm, how blade and man merged into one. Alongside this, he trained in other martial arts, archery, spear fighting, and unarmed defense. He practiced in full armor, in heat and cold, on slippery ground, in the rain, so that he would grow accustomed to any condition. He was not shielded from hardship, on the contrary, it was deliberately introduced to test how ready he was for real life. If he fell, he got up alone. If he grew tired, he continued. If he wanted to give up, he was reminded that a samurai had no right to weakness. Yet he was not deprived of other aspects of education. He learned to read and write, studied classical Chinese texts, and examined military treatises such as Sun Tzu's The Art of War, learning not only how to fight, but how to think. He was taught strategy, logic, and how to anticipate an opponent's actions. He wrote essays on honor, duty, and the nature of authority, and these were judged not by elegance of style, but by depth of understanding. Eloquence was valued, but only if it came from sincerity. He also studied arts that, at first glance, might seem far removed from war. He learned calligraphy, where every stroke had to be precise, calm, and meaningful. He participated in the tea ceremony, in which every movement was refined to perfection, and where the focus was not on the pleasure of the drink, but on the state of mind, respect for the guest, and the ability to be fully present. He wrote haiku, short poems about nature, fleeting moments, and death, and in them, he learned to see beauty in the simple, the transient, the impermanent. In Europe at the same time, a boy from a feudal family was learning to be noticeable, charming, skilled in conversation. He was valued not only for bravery, but for his ability to please. He might be rough, but if he could speak beautifully of love or recount a heroic deed, he was forgiven. In Japan, however, outward elegance only mattered if there was inner order. The beauty of a movement was important, but only if it came from discipline, not from a desire to impress. So the years passed, one day after another, exercise after exercise, mistake after mistake, until the boy gradually became what he was meant to be, not merely a master of the sword, but a man in whom strength, intellect, and spirit were in balance. When a young man received his first true sword, the katana, and was formally recognized as a samurai, it did not mean the trials were over. On the contrary, the most important stage now began, life as a warrior in the real world, where every day was a test, where honor was not proclaimed, but proven in small things, in silence, in solitude. His path no longer ended at the training hall or student duties. Now he entered the complex world of service, where his actions, decisions, even his thoughts, had to align with a strict inner code known as bushido, the way of the warrior. His first posting might be at a daimyo's castle, an administrative center in a province, or even a minor outpost on the border. He became part of a hierarchical structure where everyone knew their place, and where even the smallest deviation from the norm could be noticed and judged. His duties varied. He might stand guard, accompany his lord, attend meetings, handle documentation, or train newcomers. Sometimes he spent entire days at a desk, studying laws, writing reports, reviewing tax records. This might seem far removed from the image of a gleaming sword and thunderous battles, but for a samurai, service was service, whether with a weapon in hand or a brush between the fingers. The key was not to fail, not to make a mistake, not to disrupt the order. His day began early, as it had since childhood. He rose before dawn, performed morning exercises, meditated, checked his weapons, and dressed in plain but formal attire. He wore no bright colors, no jewelry. His appearance was meant to reflect inner restraint. Even his walk, gestures, and manner of speech were refined to perfection, not to impress, but to avoid causing irritation or drawing unnecessary attention. A samurai did not seek to be seen. He sought to be reliable. In Europe at the same time, a knight who had become a full member of the military nobility often lived a very different life. His service was also important, but it was closely tied to public life. He took part in tournaments, feasts, and ceremonies, where his bravery, nobility, and social grace were valued as much as his combat skills. His armor was adorned with crests, his horse richly caparisoned, his cloak embroidered with gold. He was a hero in the eyes of all, and his fame grew with every feat in Japan. However, fame was not encouraged. On the contrary, it was viewed with suspicion. A samurai who boasted of his deeds lost respect. His worth was not measured by how much people spoke of him, but by how flawlessly he fulfilled his duty, even if no one ever saw it. His daily life was filled with rituals. Each morning he might take part in the tea ceremony, not for pleasure, but as an exercise in focus, respect, and inner order. He learned to value the moment, not to rush, not to lose himself in distraction. Even at meals, he followed strict rules, sitting upright, speaking only when necessary, showing no greed. His home, if he had a family, was simple, neat, and free of excess. The samurai's wife also lived by strict rules. She managed the household, raised the children, and upheld the family's honor. She did not go out without reason, did not engage in idle talk, did not show emotion in public. Their marriage was less a union of hearts and more a union of duty. If the samurai had children, he raised them with the same strictness he had known. He did not spoil them, praise them for small achievements, or excuse weakness. He passed on not only skills, but inner discipline, teaching them not to fear, not to complain, not to seek approval. He knew they were the continuation of the line, and upon them would depend whether the family's honor was preserved or lost forever. So he was firm, but not cruel. His firmness was a form of respect for the future. He continued to train every day, even if he was not involved in battle. Swordsmanship, archery, physical conditioning, these remained part of his routine. He knew he could be called to duty at any moment, that an enemy might appear without warning, that his skill might save not only himself, but his lord, his comrades, his family. So he did not allow himself to relax. His body and mind had to remain in constant readiness. Yet he was not deprived of other aspects of life. He wrote poetry, especially haiku, in which he expressed his thoughts on nature, time, and death. He practiced calligraphy, not as art, but as a way to calm the mind. He read Buddhist texts, reflecting on the fleeting nature of life and the meaning of service. He might spend hours in silence, watching the garden, listening to the rain, doing nothing, and in that stillness, he found strength. For him, not being busy did not mean being idle. It was time for inner reflection, for restoring balance. In Europe, a knight might also turn to art, write poetry, or play the lute, but it was often tied to admiration for a lady of the heart, a desire to please, to earn a smile. His poetry was filled with love, dreams, passion. The samurai's poetry was colder, more restrained. It spoke of the moon, the wind, a falling cherry blossom. It did not glorify emotion, but accepted it as part of existence, as something fleeting, a reminder that all things pass, and therefore it was important to live with a clear heart. His attitude toward death remained the key difference from the European warrior. He did not fear death, because since childhood he had known it as a natural part of life. He did not pray for his soul's salvation, as the knight did, nor did he hope for heaven. He learned to accept death as inevitable, as a possible end to any day. If he lost a battle, if his lord died, if he made a serious mistake, he knew he must answer. And the answer could only be one: seppuku, ritual suicide performed with dignity, in front of witnesses, according to strict rules. This was not an act of despair. It was the final act of honor, a way to preserve dignity when nothing else could be set right. He did not perform seppuku out of fear of punishment. He did it to avoid shaming his family, to show that he acknowledged his fault, that he was willing to pay the highest price. It was not an act of weakness, but of strength. And while in Europe this might seem barbaric, in Japan it was part of a system in which honor was more important than life. So passed his adult life, not in loud feats, not in feasts, not in love intrigues, but in silence, in service, in constant work on the self. He did not seek fame. He sought only that, at the end of the day, looking at the moon beyond the window, he could say to himself, "I did not fail. I fulfilled my duty." And that was enough. The life of the samurai was not only a matter of hands and sword, but of spirit. His actions, decisions, and attitude toward life and death were shaped not merely by tradition, but by deep philosophical and religious ideas that had been woven into him since childhood and remained with him to the end. Unlike the European knight, whose worldview was built largely upon Christian faith, with its concepts of sin, salvation, and eternal life, the samurai drew strength from a blend of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. These three traditions, which might seem contradictory, came together in Japan to form a single inner space, offering the warrior stability even when chaos and death surrounded him. Central to his spiritual world was Buddhism, particularly the Zen school. It did not ask the samurai to pray, to worship, or to believe in gods. Instead, it taught silence, focus, and acceptance. Through meditation, through the repetition of the same movements, through a constant return to the present moment, he learned to master his mind, not allowing fear, anger, or doubt to take control. For a warrior who might find himself in battle at any moment, this was not mere exercise, it was survival. A mind overwhelmed by emotion hesitates. And in battle, a single hesitation means death. Thus, Zen was not philosophy for scholars, but practice for warriors. He learned not to think, but to be. Not to plan, but to respond. Not to fear, but to accept. When he sat in meditation, he asked for nothing. He simply was. And in that stillness, that near emptiness, he found a strength that could not be put into words. It was not the absence of thought, but the clarity of it, as if the mind had become a mirror, Clean, calm, reflecting reality without distortion. In Europe, the knight also sought inner strength, but in a different way. He prayed. Every morning, before battle, at the hour of death, he turned to God. His faith was personal, emotional, filled with fear and hope. He feared hell, dreamed of heaven, and repented of his sins. His conscience was under the constant watch of the church, and he strove to live so that his soul would be ready for judgment. For him, faith was a shield and guide, protecting him in battle and leading him after death. The samurai had no such shield. He had no divine judgment, no promise of eternal life. Instead, he had responsibility to himself, to his lord, to his honor. Confucianism gave him structure. It did not speak of the afterlife, but insisted on order in this world, respect for elders, loyalty to one's lord, proper relationships between people. The samurai learned to see himself not as an individual seeking happiness, but as a link in a chain, part of a family, a class, a state. His duty was not a choice, it was a given, like breath, like heartbeat. He did not ask whether he wanted to serve. He knew he must. And in this obedience, not servile, but conscious, he found freedom. Freedom from doubt, from selfishness, from the fear of being misunderstood. Taoism, though less visible in daily life, was also present in his mind. It taught going with the flow, not resisting life, not struggling against what could not be changed. The samurai knew, all things pass. Power, glory, even life itself, everything was temporary. Rather than fight this truth, he learned to accept it. He wrote poems about falling cherry blossoms, mist over the river, an old bridge, not because they were beautiful, but because they reminded him all is fleeting. And in that transience, he found beauty in beauty, comfort. Interestingly, his faith did not require renunciation of the world. He did not retreat to a monastery. He did not abandon family, service, or weapons. On the contrary, he sought enlightenment in the everyday. In the movement of the sword. In the tea ceremony. In the morning silence. In the ability not to rush. For him, spirituality was not separate from life, it was life, refined to perfection. The European knight, by contrast, often saw spirituality as the opposite of worldly life. He admired monks who had given up battle, family, and wealth. He dreamed of heavens where there would be no wars, no need to fight. His ideal was to leave the world. The samurai's ideal was to remain in it, but with a pure heart, a clear mind, and readiness to give everything at any moment. His attitude toward death was a direct consequence of this philosophy. He did not fear dying, because he knew death was not an end, but a transition, part of the natural order. He did not pray for his soul's salvation, because he did not see the soul as a separate entity awaiting reward or punishment. He saw himself as part of the whole, like a drop in the ocean. And when the drop vanishes, the ocean remains. So he could die calmly, even with a smile. He did not beg for mercy. He did not cry out. He simply completed what he had begun. Before death, he might write a haiku, a short poem expressing his view of the end. These verses were not complaints. They were acceptance. Life is like morning mist, appearing, then gone. How sad I didn't finish my tea. Or, the moon shines so clearly. Today I will die. I hope the wind doesn't rise. There was no fear in them. There was simplicity, modesty, love for the moment. He died not as a hero, but as a man who had played his part to the end. Thus, the inner world of the samurai was not a chaos of emotions, not a struggle with consciences in the night, but a constant work upon himself, a striving for balance, order, and purity of intention. He did not seek happiness. He sought a life of dignity, And if, at the end, he could say, "I did not dishonor myself," that was enough. For the samurai, death was not a taboo, not something frightening to be pushed aside or feared in the silence of night. On the contrary, it was part of his daily awareness from childhood. He did not avoid thoughts of it, he prepared for it, as an inevitable part of the path, as the final note in life that must sound with dignity. His attitude toward death was not grim, nor was it careless. It was acceptance, refined over years of discipline, meditation, and reflection on the fleeting nature of life. He knew to die was not a tragedy. The tragedy was to die without honor. If he lost in battle, if his lord died, if he made a serious mistake that brought shame, he understood that he faced not a choice between life and death, but between dishonor and honor. And this choice was clear. He was to die. Not by the enemy's hand, not by accident, not in agony, but voluntarily, by his own decision, in a prescribed manner. Thus arose the ritual of seppuku, ritual suicide, which in the Western world was often seen as brutality, but in Japan was the highest expression of dignity, an act of final freedom. Seppuku was not carried out in anger or despair. It was a calm, deliberate act, conducted according to strict ritual. The samurai dressed in white, the color of purity and death. He sat in a prescribed posture, facing north, as tradition required. Before him was placed a short sword, the wakizashi. He wrote a farewell poem, often in the form of a haiku, expressing his thoughts on life, death, and duty. This was not a farewell to loved ones, but the final word of a warrior, in which there must be no fear, complaint, or regret. Only acceptance, modesty, gratitude for the chance to serve. Then he struck, cutting his abdomen from right to left, then upward, making a motion symbolizing the opening of the inner self, a demonstration of the soul's purity. This act was excruciatingly painful, yet the samurai was not to cry out. He was to remain calm until the end. To shorten suffering, a kaishakunin, an assistant, usually a close friend or comrade, stood nearby, ready to deliver a single, precise sword stroke to decapitate the samurai immediately after the ritual began. This was not murder, it was an act of mercy and respect. Interestingly, seppuku was not a punishment imposed from above. It might be suggested, but it was carried out by one's own will. It was not a sentence, but responsibility that the samurai took upon himself. Even if no one knew of his mistake, he might still perform seppuku, because he knew. Honesty before oneself was more important than external recognition. Here lay a deep difference from European morality, where shame could be hidden, atoned for through prayer or service. In Europe, a knight who found himself in a shameful situation, such as losing a tournament, being betrayed by a lady, or accused of cowardice, might suffer a blow to reputation, but not a death sentence. He might retire to a monastery, repent, or serve in a crusade to atone for guilt. His path led to redemption, to regaining trust. In Japan, however, the path was different: no honor, no existence. Shame could not be redeemed. It could only be erased by death. Sometimes seppuku was performed not for fault, but as an act of loyalty. When a lord died, his devoted samurai might follow him in death, not out of despair, but as the final expression of fidelity. This was known as tsuigu kuon, and though later banned, in earlier times it was considered the highest virtue. The samurai did not wish to live in a world without his master. His service did not end with his lord's death, it ended with it. Even in peacetime, when there was no war, death remained part of the samurai's life. He knew he might be called at any moment, that his duty might demand the final sacrifice. He did not fear this. He prepared for it. In his home, the sword was always clean, sharp, ready for use, not only for battle, but for ritual. He did not hide it. He did not fear it. the sword was not only a weapon, but a passage to another life. When a samurai died a natural death, from illness or old age, he did so with the same calm. He did not cry out, beg for help, or plead for more time. He might ask for tea, write a final poem, bid farewell to his family, but without tears, without drama. He saw death as the natural concluding act, as a return to the flow of life. His funeral was modest. No loud weeping, no lavish feasts. The body was cremated or buried in a simple grave. On the stone only the name and dates might be carved, nothing more. He was not glorified. He was respected. His last words, if recorded, were rarely about glory, feats, or enemies. More often, they were about simple things, the moon, the garden, how good it would be to finish his tea. In this lay the essence of his philosophy: life is not measured by the number of deeds, but by the quality of the soul. He did not seek immortality through fame. He sought only that his family's name remain untarnished. Thus the samurai died, not with a cry, not with curses, not with pleas, but with dignity, clarity, and a sense of completion. He did not fear death, because he had lived in such a way as to face it without shame. When a samurai died, his life did not turn into a loud legend, nor did it become the subject of ballads sung to lute music in castle halls, as was often the case with European knights. His deeds, if he had any, were rarely described in detail, not celebrated in folk songs, not turned into widespread fame. His name might not even reach the next generation. But this did not mean he was forgotten. On the contrary, he remained in memory not as a hero, but as an example, a living embodiment of duty, honor, and restraint, and this memory was passed not through songs, but through silence, through tradition, through the behavior of those who came after him. His grave was simple. No ornate headstones, no life-sized sculptures, no lengthy inscriptions about heroic feats. More often, just a stone with his name, dates of life, and perhaps a short phrase about loyalty or service. Sometimes a small altar stood nearby, where relatives left tea, flowers, or rice. But there was no wailing, no dramatic grief, no desire to glorify the fallen. Instead, quiet recognition of the fact: he lived, he served, he left. And that was enough. His legacy was not sought in chronicles or legends. It lived in how his children behaved in society, how his wife managed the household, how his students continued their training. It was in the fact that no one dishonored the family, that traditions were preserved, that honor remained intact. For the samurai, memory was not measured by loudness, but by depth. He did not wish to be spoken of. He wished to be repeated, not in glory, but in spirit. Sometimes, if he performed a particularly noble act, such as dying while protecting his lord, or committing seppuku for a mistake no one else noticed, his story was passed down orally, from teacher to student, from father to son. These accounts were not embellished. There was no magic, no miracles. But there was the power of example. They were not told as once a great warrior defeated 100 enemies, but as a samurai, knowing he had broken a promise, left with dignity. And no one else ever knew about it. Such stories did not inspire feats of bravery, they taught not to fail. They reminded, honor is what you protect, even when no one is watching. In Europe, however, memory of the knight was built differently. His death in battle might become the subject of a poem. His name was carved into armor, his crest hung in the castle hall, his deeds retold at court. He was celebrated. He was held up as an example to young squires. His courage, nobility, love for a lady became part of his legend. For the knight, memory was external, it lived in words, in songs, in visual images. He wanted to be remembered. The samurai wanted to be understood, even if his name was forgotten. His legacy did not vanish with his death. It continued to live in everyday life. In the upright posture of his son. In the quiet endurance of his wife. In the way his student held a sword, sat down, answered a question. It lived in the tea ceremony, in calligraphy, in haiku about the moon, in everything that required focus, respect, inner order. The samurai did not leave behind wealth or titles, he left a model of behavior, meant to be reenacted, not repeated in words. Interestingly, even in peacetime, when war ceased and the samurai's role became increasingly bureaucratic, his ideals did not disappear. They transformed. His discipline, modesty, self-control became the foundation for future generations, not only warriors, but also officials, teachers, and masters of art. In Japan today, one can still meet people who speak softly, move smoothly, and remain composed under stress, and in this, one senses the spirit of the samurai, not as an archaic relic, but as a living part of culture. His legacy was not frozen. It was not preserved in museums as a relic, but lived on, in martial arts schools, in business ethics, in attitudes toward work. Zen discipline, respect for the teacher, willingness to sacrifice for the common good, these can still be seen today, not in armor, but in offices, factories, and classrooms. Japanese work culture, with its punctuality, responsibility, and modesty, owes much to samurai ideals. Even in art, his influence remains visible. The films of Akira Kurosawa, where warriors speak less than they remain silent, where decisive moments follow long stillness, are not merely cinema, they are continuations of philosophy. They lack pomp, lack loud victories, but carry deep feelings of duty, dignity, and acceptance. Such films do not entertain, they make one reflect. Just like the samurai himself. His image in culture did not become mythical, like the knight with a sword in stone or banners fluttering above his head. He remained human, grounded, close. Not rich, not handsome, not loud, but reliable. And this is precisely why he continues to command respect. People do not dream of becoming a samurai as a legendary hero. But many wish to live as he did, with honor, with discipline, with the ability to stay silent at the right moment. Thus, memory of the samurai did not fade. It did not become a spectacle, nor mere entertainment. It remained in silence, in behavior, in inner order. He did not leave behind loud words. He left an example. And that was more than enough. When one looks at the path of the samurai, from the first cry in a modest estate to the final breath beneath the moon, it seems almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. Not because of the sword, not because of seppuku, not because of strictness, but because this path was built on different foundations than those we are used to. It was not aimed at happiness, self-fulfillment, or freedom of choice. It was aimed at service, honor, and inner order. And in this lies its deep difference, not only from the modern world, but also from other warrior traditions, including the European one. Comparing the path of the samurai and the son of a feudal lord, one sees that both were raised as warriors, both served their masters, both endured trials and battles. But while the European knight sought external recognition, glory, the love of a lady, and a heroic image in the eyes of others, the samurai sought inner harmony, the fulfillment of duty, and a life in which honor did not depend on whether his actions were seen or not. One lived for people. The other lived for duty. One wished to be great. The other wished only not to fail. The European knight, raised in the Christian tradition, sought salvation of the soul, feared hell, and hoped for heaven. His virtue was often tied to repentance, mercy, and faith in God. He could make mistakes, but he could also atone. His path was correctable. The samurai, raised in the world of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Zen, did not seek salvation. He sought balance, purity of intention, and readiness for death. For him, a mistake that brought shame could not be atoned for. It demanded a response, and the only possible response was death. His path was irreversible. Interestingly, both warriors were strict, but in different ways. The knight could be rough, quicker-tempered, even cruel, but if he showed bravery and loyalty, society forgave him much. The samurai, however, had to be restrained, calm, disciplined. His strength was not measured in blows, but in his ability not to react, not to lose temper, not to show weakness. His strictness was not directed at others, but at himself. His upbringing was not aimed at winning a tournament, winning hearts, or achieving loud feats. It was aimed at shaping character, at the ability to live in harmony with oneself, a readiness to serve without seeking recognition. He was not taught to be a hero, but to be a man who keeps his word, even when no one else knows about it. It is precisely in this that lies the samurai's greatest mystery and strength. He did not seek glory. He did not fear death. He did not demand rewards. He simply fulfilled his duty, quietly, strictly, to the end. And in this lies something that continues to command respect even today, in a world that values brightness, success, and self-expression. Comparing these two paths, one sees that neither is better or worse. They are different answers to the same question, how should a warrior live? One answer is through faith, love, and heroism. The other, through discipline, honor, and silence. One is like the hero of a novel. The other, like a 7-word poem. Interestingly, despite all differences, both warriors shared something essential, the understanding of duty. For the knight, duty was tied to God, to his lord, to his lady. For the samurai, it was tied to his master, his family, and his inner code. But in both cases, it was something greater than personal desire. It was a commitment that could not be postponed, ignored, or passed on. It is also important that both were raised in strict conditions, where weakness was not forgiven, and every step mattered. But while in Europe weakness could be atoned for through a heroic act, in Japan it demanded a personal response. This made the samurai more solitary in his decisions. He could not rely on forgiveness. He had to accept the consequences himself. Today, in a world of constant change, shifting values, and uncertainty about whom or what to serve, the samurai's path may seem too severe. But within it lies a point of stability. It reminds us that one can live not for recognition, not for success, but for inner honesty. That what matters is not how much people speak of you, but how you behave when no one is watching. His legacy is not in the sword, not in the armor, not in seppuku. It lies in the ability to be oneself, in the strength to remain calm, in respect for tradition, and in the readiness to give everything for what one believes is right. He was not a model to imitate in detail, but he remains an example of endurance. When we look at the samurai, we do not merely see a warrior from a distant past. We see the possibility of another way of life, one built not on desire, but on responsibility, not on glory, but on dignity. And though we are unlikely to sit in meditation each morning or write haiku before death, there is something in his path that we can take with us, not as a costume, not as a ritual, but as an inner attitude. He did not teach how to win. He taught how not to give up. He did not teach how to be strong. He taught how not to be weak. He did not teach how to be a hero. He taught how to remain oneself, in battle, in silence, in death. And in this lies his enduring strength. Let's begin with the most elegant lie ever sold by history, that kings were clean. They weren't. They were glorified compost heaps with fancy hats. The truth? The royal chamber pot wasn't emptied with dignity. It was tipped straight into the moat. And not because someone forgot where the bin was, no, it was policy. Official, sealed-stamped, probably blessed by a nervous monk. You think a moat keeps out invaders? Try a moat thick with yesterday's soup, last night's wine, and the king's personal contribution to national defense. That wasn't sewage, that was strategy. If a knight swam through that and still wanted to fight, he deserved the throne. Honestly, it was the medieval version of a do not enter sign, but with more smell and fewer words. Imagine, if you will, a grand castle. Tall towers, fluttering banners, the sun glinting off stained glass. And beneath it all, bubbling gently like a witch's stew, the moat, rich with centuries of royal waste. They didn't call it the water feature back then, but they should have. It wasn't just water. It was a cocktail. Aged urine, fermented slop, the occasional lost slipper. Ducks avoided it. Fish floated belly up, not from poison, but from sheer disappointment. And yet, the king would stand on his balcony, sniff the air, and say, "Ah, spring." Either he was mad, or he'd been breathing this for so long that fresh air would have knocked him over like a slap. The thing is, they didn't see it as dirty. They saw it as power. The more you could afford to let rot around you, the more important you were. Peasants washed. That was common. Kings? They transcended washing. Their smell was a statement. I am so high above you, it said, that I don't even need to pretend I'm not standing in my own leftovers. A visiting noble once fainted during dinner. Not from the food, though that was questionable, but from the Lord's armpits, which apparently had their own weather system. They carried him outside, revived him with vinegar, and then praised the host for his robust presence. That's the key word, presence. In more ways than one. And the servants? Oh, they were the real heroes. Picture a young boy, no older than 12, carrying a silver chamber pot through 3 echoing halls, past tapestries, past guards, past ladies who pretended not to notice. But they noticed. Everyone noticed. The pot wasn't heavy, but the weight of it, the knowledge that he held the king's most private moment in his hands, that was crushing. And he had to walk slowly, gracefully, like he wasn't holding a biological weapon. If he stumbled, that wasn't just a spill. That was treason. Or at least, that's what the head steward said while kicking him down the stairs later. But the boy didn't complain. He was proud. He was part of the royal machine. He helped maintain the aroma of authority. You'd think someone would have suggested a better system. A drain, perhaps. A pipe. Something. But no. Water was suspicious. Cleanliness was linked to vanity, and vanity was one step away from sin. Also, pipes cost money, and money was better spent on hats with feathers so long they required their own room. Besides, if you built a proper toilet, where would the rats live? The castle needed balance. Rats in the walls, waste in the moat, prayers in the chapel, it was a full ecosystem. God made the world, but man made the smell, and frankly, man was winning. The best part? They thought it kept them safe. Not just the moat, but the smell itself. Bad air, or miasma, as they dramatically called it, caused disease, they believed. So, if the air was already terrible, adding more couldn't hurt. It was like saying, well, the house is on fire, might as well light a cigarette. They'd wave herbs around, burn rosemary, hang stinking bundles of wormwood from the rafters, all to purify air that hadn't been pure since the Romans left. It didn't work, of course. But it smelled different, and different felt like progress. Progress that smelled like a goat's nightmare. And let's talk about the queens. Poor women. They had to sit on the same pots, breathe the same air, smile through banquets where the main course and the guest of honor competed for who reeked more. One queen reportedly kept a small bottle of vinegar under her sleeve and took delicate sips whenever the king leaned in to whisper. Not because she was thirsty, because she needed to reset her nose. Another wore a crown with tiny holes so that perfumed silk could hang down over her nostrils. Fashion with function. Or desperation with jewels. You might think, well, surely they bath sometimes? And yes, technically. But bathing in the 1200s meant sitting in a wooden tub while 3 servants argued about whether water touching the soul was a sin. They'd pour a jug over your head, declare it done, and then burn the water just in case it was corrupted. The average noble bathed once a year, usually before Christmas, unless it rained, or the stars were wrong, or someone sneezed twice in a row. Hygiene was not a science. It was a series of superstitions held together by prayer and denial. But here's the real kicker. The moat wasn't even the worst part. That honor went to the Jakes. The Jakes! Yes, that was the word. Not toilet, not privy, not even bathroom. Jakes! It sounded like a bad nickname, but no, it was the place where you sat over a hole, dangled your dignity above a pit of centuries, old filth, and hoped the wooden seat didn't give way. Some Jakes were in towers. Literally. You'd climb up, do your business, and whatever fell went down through the castle, through cracks, through history, until it joined the moat in its slow, stinking journey toward the sea. Archaeologists today find these pits and weep, not from sadness, but from memory. And yet, people lived like this. They fell in love. They wrote poetry. They went to war over who got to sit where at dinner. All while breathing air that could strip bark from trees. You start to wonder, did they even notice? Or did their noses just give up, like a dog that's been rolled in something awful and now considers it perfume? Probably the latter. After a few weeks in a castle, you stop smelling the rot. You start to miss it when it's gone. Like coming home. So next time you complain about a blocked drain or a smelly bin, remember the kings of old. They didn't have plumbers. They had tradition. And if you dared suggest a window that opened, or a bucket that didn't leak, you weren't just questioning hygiene, you were attacking the very foundation of power. The throne wasn't just guarded by knights. It was protected by stench. And honestly, it worked. No invader ever made it past the second tower. Not because of arrows. Because of the smell. And as the wind carried the royal aroma across the fields, peasants knelt, not in prayer, but in self-defense. The age of chivalry wasn't just about honor and swords. It was about holding your breath and pretending you didn't just see the king scratch where no sunlight ever reached. That was loyalty. That was medieval life. And that, my friend, was the scent of power. Here's a thought that would have made a nobleman faint into his soup: the poor smelled better than the rich. Not because they had better soap, they didn't have soap at all, but because they weren't afraid of water. While lords and ladies treated baths like dangerous religious rituals, peasants were out there in the rivers, scrubbing their arms with sand and herbs, laughing, splashing, living. They didn't write poems about it. They didn't need to. Their secret weapon wasn't perfume. It was common sense. And occasionally, a handful of mint. Imagine a summer morning in a village. The sun is warm, the birds are singing, and down by the stream, a dozen people are knee-deep in water, scrubbing clothes, hair, and themselves. They're not doing it for vanity. They're doing it because yesterday's pig dusty job left its mark, and nobody wants to sleep next to someone who smells like a forgotten cheese. So in they go. Cold water, rough stone, maybe a bit of ash from the fire to help with the grease. It's not luxurious, but it works. And when they walk back to the huts, damp and shivering, they leave behind a trail of something almost pleasant: wet earth, crushed time, human skin that hasn't given up. Now, contrast that with the lord of the manor, sitting in his hall, wrapped in velvet, sweating through 3 layers of wool, refusing to bathe because he's heard, from a monk who once read half a sentence from a Greek book, that water opens the pores to disease. Not just any disease. All disease. Especially the kind that comes from being clean. Yes, really. They believed that. Not metaphorically. Literally. If you washed too much, the air would sneak in through your skin and fill your body with bad humors, which would then turn into fever, or madness, or worse, commoners. And nothing scared the nobility more than accidentally smelling like someone who worked for a living. So instead of water, they used workarounds. A splash of vinegar behind the ears. A dab of rosewater on the temples. A little bag of dried lavender tucked into the armpit. They called it a pomander, which sounded fancy, but was basically a medieval deodorant made by someone who'd never actually smelt a real armpit. Some pomanders were even made of silver, shaped like apples or skulls, because nothing says I'm fresh like wearing a tiny metal corpse under your arm. The idea was that the herbs would ward off bad air. In reality, they mostly just added a floral note to the existing symphony of sweat, old wine, and despair. And yet, the poor, those dirty, ragged, washed poor, were the ones who actually smelled all right. Not like roses. Not like anything you'd want to bottle. But not like a crime scene, either. They used what they had. Sunlight. Wind. Smoke from the fire. A roll in the grass after rain. They didn't have perfumers, but they had instinct. They knew that if you slept near a cow, you'd smell like a cow. So they didn't. They knew that if you boiled your clothes in herbs, they wouldn't just be cleaner, they'd smell like dinner, which was better than smelling like last week's dinner still stuck to you. The irony? The rich looked down on them for being unclean. They used words like filthy and reeking to describe peasants, not because they were dirty, but because they weren't like them. To a noble, clean skin was suspicious. It suggested independence. It suggested you didn't need servants to carry your waste. It suggested you might be too healthy, which was basically a personality flaw in a time when illness was a sign of divine attention. If you never got sick, people started to wonder, are you even trying to be holy? There's a story, probably made up, but feels true, about a visiting count who rode into a village and immediately covered his nose with a silk cloth soaked in musk. "Good heavens," he said, "what is that smell?" And the villagers looked at each other, confused. Because to them, it was just air. Fresh. With a hint of baking bread, wood smoke, and the distant promise of onions. But to the Count, it was chaos. It wasn't controlled stench. It wasn't layered, like in a castle, where you had the base note of mildew, the middle of fermented rushes, and the top of human breath that hadn't been cleaned since the Crusades. No, this was natural. And nature, to a nobleman, was just God's first draft. Still, the poor didn't brag about their hygiene. They didn't need to. They lived in a world where function beat fashion. If your feet stank, you washed them. If your shirt reeked, you boiled it. If your neighbor smelled bad, you told them, politely, and offered a sprig of sage. No drama. No theology. Just life. Meanwhile, in the castle, they were holding debates about whether bathing on a Tuesday might anger the saints. One bishop claimed that regular washing led to lustful thoughts. Another said it weakened the soul. A third, more practical one, just said, "I tried it once and my wig fell off, and that was enough to ban it for another 50 years. And let's talk about hair. Noble hair was a fortress. Layers of grease, powder, pins, and prayers held it in place for weeks. Washing it? Out of the question. It would take days to rebuild. So instead, they covered it. Wimples, veils, hats with feathers that could blind a horse. The goal wasn't beauty, it was containment. Keep the smell in, the bugs out, and the illusion alive. Peasants, on the other hand, cut their hair short, combed it with bones, and let the wind do the styling. And when they got lice, they dealt with it. Not with incantations, but with nit-picking and hot water. Simple. Effective. Humiliating? Maybe. But less humiliating than pretending your wig was resting when it was actually being scraped clean in a back room. The real tragedy is that this fear of water lasted for centuries. Not because there was evidence. Not because people were sick after bathing, they weren't. But because the idea took root, cleanliness is rebellion. If you wash, you're saying the world isn't filthy by design. You're saying you can improve on God's mess. And that was dangerous. So they didn't. They sweated. They itched. They waved herbs and muttered prayers and called it hygiene. And all the while, down by the river, children played in the shallows, their skin clean, their laughter loud, their smell, honestly, not far off from what you'd want in a human being. Not perfect. Not perfumed. But alive. Not hiding from the world, but part of it. They didn't fear the water. They thanked it. And when they walked back to their homes, damp and happy, the air around them was lighter. Not because of magic. Not because of status. Just because they'd had the courage to get wet. So the next time you step into a shower and think, modern luxury, remember this, the idea of washing yourself wasn't invented in the 1800s. It was remembered. Dragged back from the peasants, the riverbanks, the forgotten corners of common sense. The nobles had the money, the power, the crowns. But the poor? They had the noses. And in the end, they were the ones who knew, sometimes, the cleanest thing you can be is honest. even if you're standing in a cold stream, shivering, with a bar of ash and a dream. And as the sun set over the fields, and the smoke rose from 100 small fires, the smell wasn't grand. It wasn't royal. But it was real. And in a world built on lies, that was the rarest perfume of all. Here's a fact that would make a saint blush: the holier the place, the worse it smelled. Cathedrals, chapels, abbeys, these were not houses of God so much as houses of mildew. The air inside wasn't just thick with prayer. It was thick with sweat, damp stone, and the quiet despair of people who'd been kneeling on cold floors since dawn. And the smell? Imagine a cellar that's been left shut for 100 years. Add a few dozen wool cloaks that have never seen water, throw in a choir boy who hasn't changed his socks since Easter, and then light a bonfire of rosemary. That was divine service. That was worship. You'd think a place meant for purity would be clean. But no. The church didn't fear dirt. It feared doubt. And so, while it could ban dancing, forbid bathing, and excommunicate a man for missing Mass, it couldn't quite figure out how to stop the smell. It wasn't from sin, though they blamed that too. It was from people. Hundreds of them, packed together, breathing, sweating, praying, occasionally fainting. The pews weren't just wooden, they were seasoned. Decades of bodies pressing into the same spots, leaving behind layers of grease, hair, and something the sexton called spiritual residue. Probably best not to ask. And the stone, oh, the stone. It looked majestic. Cold, grey, carved with angels and demons and scenes of eternal punishment. But touch it, and your fingers came away damp. Not from tears of repentance. From weeping walls. The church was always wet. Rain seeped in. Breath condensed on the arches. Candles dripped wax that never hardened because the air was too thick. It wasn't a building. It was a living thing, breathing in the prayers and breathing out a fog that smelled like forgotten laundry and regret. But here's the real trick: they knew it stank. And instead of opening a window, which would have helped, they decided the problem wasn't the air. The problem was that the air wasn't holy enough. So they burned incense. Not a little. Not just on special days. They burned it like it was going out of fashion, which, in a way, it never did. Thick, greasy smoke curled up to the rafters, clinging to the frescoes, staining the saints' faces a gentle yellow. The idea was that the sweet smell would drive out the bad air. In reality, it just mixed with it. Like trying to hide onions by spraying perfume on them. Now you don't just smell onions. You smell fancy onions. Incense wasn't spiritual. It was survival. The priest swung his censer like a man fending off bees, sending clouds of myrrh into the pews like a fog machine at a very serious concert. If you could still smell feet after that, you were either blessed or cursed, probably both. The congregation sat there, eyes watering, noses twitching, pretending to be moved by the sermon, while really just wondering if the smell was supposed to make them holy or make them vomit. Some wept. Not from guilt. From smoke inhalation. And the robes, don't get me started on the robes. The bishop's vestments weren't washed. They were aired. Which meant they were taken outside for an hour, slapped a few times, and then put back on, still holding the essence of 100 sermons, spilled wine, and the bishop's own unique contribution to the atmosphere. They said the garments were sacred, that they carried the weight of office. They didn't say they carried the weight of mildew, but they did. You could smell a bishop coming from down the street. Not because of his entourage, because of his aroma. It was a mix of beeswax, old bread, and something vaguely fungal. People knelt not just out of respect, but because the smell hit lower first. Confessionals were worse. Tiny wooden boxes where sinners whispered their darkest secrets into a grill while breathing air that had been recycled since the Black Death. The priest sat on one side, sweating in his cassock, listening to tales of lust, greed, and sheep theft, all while trying not to pass out from the combination of guilt and body odor. Some priests kept a sprig of mint in their sleeve. Others just held their breath. A few developed a twitch. It wasn't the sins that got to them. It was the aftermath, the lingering scent of a man who'd walked 10 miles through a pig field to get there, then lied about it. And yet, they called this purity. They said the church was a place of light, of truth, of divine presence. And maybe it was. But it was also a place where a single open window was seen as a threat to faith. Let in fresh air? A monk once said, scandalized. And let in demons? Next you'll want to scrub the altar. Because, of course, cleaning was suspicious. If something was too clean, it might not be holy. Holiness, in those days, came with a certain grit. A certain dampness. A certain smell that made you feel small, unworthy, and slightly nauseous. That was the point. If you walked out feeling better, you hadn't suffered enough. The irony? The people who came to church to escape the filth of the world were walking into the filthiest room in town. The market stank, yes. The stables reeked, absolutely. But at least there, the smell made sense. Here, it was sacred. They didn't clean the floors because dirt showed humility. They didn't wash the altar cloths because stains proved devotion. One abbey even kept a puddle in the corner of the chapel to remind the brothers of their mortality. It wasn't just damp. It was alive. Frogs were rumored. No one confirmed it. But the singing got quieter near that corner. And the candles, hundreds of them, dripping wax, burning animal fat, filling the air with a greasy film that coated everything, including the lungs. The light was soft, golden, holy. The air was thick, yellow, and tasted like a roast that had gone slightly wrong. People said they felt closer to God in that glow. Maybe they did. Or maybe they were just light-headed from the fumes. Either way, it worked. Faith doesn't need fresh air. It needs atmosphere. And the church had plenty. Children were brought in as babies to be baptized, not because the water was clean, it wasn't, but because the ritual mattered more than the result. The font sat in the corner, covered in a cloth that hadn't been changed since the Reformation, was a twinkle in someone's eye. The water inside was stale, cloudy, and possibly home to a small civilization. But no one complained. To question the font was to question grace. To suggest a scrub was to suggest God couldn't handle a bit of slime. So they dipped the babies, said the words, and hoped the smell of incense would cover the smell of mildew clinging to the infant's blanket. And outside, the world carried on. The sun shone. The rivers ran. The peasants washed in the streams, laughed, lived. But inside, the doors stayed shut. The windows stayed closed. The smoke kept rising. Because to let in fresh air was to let in doubt. And in a time when faith was everything, the last thing you wanted was to breathe too deeply and realize what you were really kneeling in. So the church stood, grand and grey, its bells calling the faithful, its spires pointing to heaven, its insides quietly rotting. Not from neglect. From devotion. They kept the stink because they thought it kept the soul. They burned incense, not to smell nice, but to pretend they weren't drowning in the smell of themselves. And every Sunday, the people came, knelt, prayed, and left carrying the scent with them, a little whiff of holiness, a little whiff of damp, and the quiet understanding that sometimes, the closest you get to God is when you can no longer smell your own life. And as the last hymn faded and the doors creaked shut, the building settled. The candles flickered. The smoke curled. And somewhere, deep in the walls, a drop of water fell. Not from rain. From the ceiling. From the roof. From the sky. From the world outside, where the air was free, and clean, and completely, utterly ignored. Here's the romantic truth no troubadour ever sang. The man writing a poem about a lady's eyes like stars was probably sitting in a room that smelled like fermented cabbage and yesterday's regret. And the lady? She was breathing through her mouth, hoping her suitor wouldn't get too close. Because love in the 1200s wasn't about passion. It was about positioning. Standing downwind. Smiling politely. Pretending you couldn't smell the knight's helmet hair after 3 days of wearing it to bed. Courtly love wasn't romance. It was olfactory diplomacy. You've heard of love letters? They were written by men who hadn't washed their hands since they last held a sword. The ink smudged not because of tears, but because their fingers were greasy. And the paper, oh, the paper. It absorbed scent like a sponge. So when a damsel unfolded a sonnet comparing her breath to spring meadows, she was actually inhaling a mix of sweat, candle wax, and the faint tang of something that might have been garlic or might have been despair. Still, she smiled. Because in those days, affection wasn't measured in kisses. It was measured in how long you could stand near someone without needing fresh air. The idea of romance was beautiful, on paper. Knights swore oaths on holy relics to serve their ladies from afar. They jousted. They sang. They wept into their gloves. But the reality? The closer they got, the worse it became. Imagine the scene, a grand hall, candles flickering, a lute playing softly in the corner. The knight approaches, heart pounding, eyes full of devotion. He kneels. He takes her hand. And then the wind shifts. It hits her like a sack of old turnips. Not him. Not entirely. But around him. The wool of his tunic unwashed for weeks. The leather of his boots still holding the memory of a stable. The faint, sour note rising from under his armpit, a place so rarely visited, some believed it had its own climate. She doesn't flinch. She's been trained for this. Instead, she fans herself gently with a scrap of silk and says, "How brave you look today, sir." Which, in the secret language of the time, meant, "Please move 3 steps to the left and never come back." They didn't talk about smell. That would have been vulgar. Instead, they used code. Your presence is powerful. You carry the strength of the wildwoods. Your aura is unmistakable. All of which meant you are emitting something that has startled the dogs. But no one admitted it. To complain about scent was to admit you noticed the body. And the body, in polite society, didn't exist. Except when it did. And then you just had to deal with it. Perfume? Oh, they tried. But perfume in the 1200s wasn't a delicate mist from a glass bottle. It was a paste. A mush. Sometimes made from crushed flowers, yes, but also from animal fat, honey, and things best left unnamed. One popular recipe called for rose petals, civet, which came from a cat's glands, no, really, and a splash of vinegar to bind the spirits. It didn't smell fresh. It smelled busy. Like a garden that had been attacked by a small animal and then set on fire. But it was expensive. And that was the point. If it cost a fortune and made your eyes water, it must be good. Ladies carried little bags of dried herbs, lavender, thyme, mint, and held them near their faces during gatherings. Not because they were fragrant. Because they were weapons. Aromatherapy, medieval style. One whiff of that, and you could survive a full minute near the bishop. These were called nosegays, which sounded sweet, but were really just biological countermeasures. A nosegay wasn't a gift. It was a shield. And if you received one, it wasn't because someone loved you. It was because they'd noticed you'd been near the stables. And then there were the gloves. Long, elegant, made of soft leather. Knights wore them to hold lances. Ladies wore them to hide their hands. But they also served another purpose. They were soaked in herbs. Rosemary. Sage. Sometimes even crushed cloves. So when a suitor took a lady's hand, he wasn't just touching her. He was breathing in a cloud of botanical distraction. It didn't make her smell better. It just made everything smell like a spice market after a storm. Which, honestly, was an improvement. Kissing? Don't be naive. Kissing was rare. And when it happened, it was on the cheek. Briefly. Like a bird landing on a fence. And only after careful assessment of the air. A proper courtship could last years, not because of obstacles or family feuds, but because neither party could get close enough without wanting to escape. Love letters were safer. At least you could read them outside. Marriage wasn't much better. The wedding night was a gamble. You might have spent months writing poems to your bride, praising her golden hair and dove-like grace. But the first time you shared a bed? That was when reality arrived. In the dark, with the door shut, there was no escaping it. The warmth. The breath. The quiet, persistent smell of someone who had been wearing the same under-tunic for a week. Some marriages lasted. Some ended before dawn. Not because of incompatibility. Because of olfactory betrayal. And yet they believed in love. Truly. They just believed in it from a distance. Like admiring a painting through a window. You could feel moved. You could be inspired. But you didn't have to touch it. That was the secret of medieval romance. It worked best when no one got too close. Emotion thrived in the open air. Affection bloomed in the breeze. And if you had to whisper sweet nothings, you did it from across the room, preferably with a light wind at your back. One poet wrote that his lady's breath was like the first wind of April over blooming hills. A beautiful line. Poignant. Romantic. And completely, utterly false. Her breath was probably sharp with onions and weak wine. Her teeth were not white. They were present. And her mouth hadn't been near water in days. But he didn't know that. He saw her from afar. He heard her voice. He imagined the rest. And that was enough. Imagination was the best deodorant of all. They didn't need closeness. They needed idea. The idea of beauty. The idea of purity. The idea of a woman who smelled of roses, even if the only rose nearby was dead and stuck to a wall. The truth didn't matter. The dream did. And as long as the lute played and the candles burned, and no one stood too close for too long, the illusion held. So the next time you complain about bad breath on a date, remember the knights and ladies of old. They didn't have mints. They didn't have toothbrushes. They didn't even have the concept of freshening up. They had poetry. And distance. And a lot of silent suffering. They loved not because it was easy, but because it was impossible, and they tried anyway, one polite bow at a time, one herb-filled glove, one carefully worded compliment about aura and presence and the wild, untamed woods. And as the moon rose over the castle, and the crickets sang, and the wind carried away the worst of it, two people sat apart, smiling, pretending they couldn't smell anything at all. Which, in its own quiet way, was the most romantic thing of all. Let's talk about the beating heart of medieval life, the marketplace. Not the quiet village square with a few cabbages and a nervous chicken. No, we're talking about the big one. The crowded, roaring, stinking beast of a place where cities came to buy, sell, argue, and breathe air so thick it felt like chewing. And the smell? Imagine a compost heap that's been invited to a party, stayed too long, and started flirting with the cheese. That was the market. That was civilization. Here's the wildest truth. In Paris, the main market once closed for a full week, not because of plague, not because of war, not because the king had a headache, but because the smell knocked out 3 merchants. One fainted while weighing sausages. Another collapsed after a customer leaned in to haggle. The third just sat down on a sack of barley and said, "I can't do this anymore," before being carried away by 2 boys who immediately asked for a raise. It wasn't recorded in the royal chronicles, but it was remembered. In whispers. In dreams. In the way people still avoid that corner of the city. The market wasn't just a place to shop. It was an assault. On the eyes, yes. On the ears, absolutely. But mostly on the nose. It didn't sneak up on you. It charged. One moment you're walking down a quiet street, thinking about your day. The next, wham, a wall of odor hits you like a wet blanket soaked in regret. You don't smell it slowly. You're engulfed. And there's no going back. Your nose has been taken hostage. Every stall had its own signature scent. The fishmonger? That was the one with the eyes. Not his, the fish's. They stared at you, glassy and judging, while their bodies turned slowly into something that no longer resembled food. The smell wasn't just fishy. It was personal. Like the sea had sent a message, "You thought you could eat me? Look what I've become." People bought it anyway. Not because it was fresh. Because it was cheap. And because if you cooked it long enough, the neighbors would stop complaining, at least until the next batch arrived. Then there was the meat. Not in a fridge. Not in a shade. Just hanging there. In the sun. On a hook. Next to a dog that was also looking at it like it might be dinner. The butcher didn't wear gloves. He wore pride. And an apron that had been through wars. Flies weren't pests. They were staff. They buzzed around like they owned the place, which, in a way, they did. The meat wasn't labeled by cut. It was labeled by how long it's been there. Regulars could tell just by sniffing. "Ah, this one's from Tuesday," they'd say, as if that were a good thing. The cheese stall was worse. Not because of the cheese itself, though some of it moved on its own, but because of the bouquet. One type looked like a rock, smelled like a wet cellar, and was said to have survived the last siege. Another bubbled slightly when you tapped it. The vendor claimed it was maturing. Customers claimed it was alive. No one argued. They just bought a small piece, paid extra for a cloth to wrap it in, and took it home to keep in a box they never opened again. And the vegetables, don't get started. They weren't displayed on clean beds of ice. They were dumped in carts, half rotten, covered in mud, occasionally still attached to something that looked like a root but might have been a creature. Cabbages were brown at the edges. Onions had sprouted green hair. Carrots were soft. But they were sold with enthusiasm. Fresh from the field. The seller would cry, which meant dug up yesterday and rolled through a pig pen on the way here. People bought them anyway. Not because they trusted the man. Because they were hungry. And because, compared to the fish, they smelled like hope. The real problem wasn't the food. It was the system. Nothing was thrown away. Not ever. If meat went off, it was boiled until it stopped arguing. If bread grew fur, it was called seasoned and sold to pilgrims. If a chicken stopped moving, it was resting and put back on display. Waste went into the street. Not in bins. Not in carts. Just tipped. So the ground wasn't dirt. It was a kind of soup. A slurry of mud, urine, old cabbage water, and things you didn't want to identify. Walking through the market wasn't walking. It was wading. And every step released a new wave of aroma, like opening a book that hadn't been touched in 100 years, but the book was made of meat. Animals didn't help. Goats wandered freely. Chickens pecked at scraps. Pigs, yes, pigs, were allowed in some markets because they cleaned up. Which they did. By eating the rot, rolling in the slop, and then being sold as meat. It was a full circle. A dirty, stinking, slightly squealing circle. One man reportedly tried to sell a pig he'd just seen eat a dead rat. "It's lean," he said, "and full of protein." He was arrested, not for the rat, but for false advertising. The pig was clearly not lean. Traders held cloths to their faces. Not masks. Just rags. Some soaked in vinegar. Others in wine. A few used herbs, crushed in their palms and rubbed under the nose like war paint. It didn't work. But it made them feel prepared. Like soldiers going into battle. And in a way, they were. The market wasn't commerce. It was survival. You went in with a list. You came out with something that might be what you wanted, and a smell that stayed in your clothes for days. Children ran through the chaos, laughing, chasing chickens, stepping in things they didn't notice. They didn't mind the smell. They didn't know any different. To them, this was normal. This was life. They'd grown up breathing air that could peel paint. Their noses had given up. Their parents said it was character building. Really, it was just building a thick, invisible layer of stench that followed them everywhere, like a loyal, terrible pet. And yet, the market never closed. Not for long. Because hunger is stronger than pride. And cheaper than perfume. People came back. Every day. They held their breath. They looked up. They pretended not to notice the fly in their soup. And they smiled. Not because they were happy. Because if you frowned, you might breathe in too deeply. The market was chaos. It was filth. It was alive. It smelled like the end of the world and the beginning of dinner. And somehow, it worked. Not because it was clean. Not because it was safe. But because it was there. A place where life, in all its messy, stinking glory, refused to be polite. And as the sun set and the stalls were cleared, or mostly cleared, the wind would sometimes shift. Just for a moment. And you'd catch a whiff of something clean. A flower in a window. A loaf of fresh bread. The river, far away. And for a second, you could almost forget. Almost believe that the world wasn't built on rot and denial. That people weren't just holding their breath and pretending. But then a goat would belch. Or a cart would spill. Or the fishmonger would open his secret box of extra ripe eels. And the truth would return. Heavy. Wet. Inescapable. The market wasn't just a place to buy food. It was a reminder that civilization is thin. That order is temporary. And that no matter how many poems you write about roses, sometimes you just have to live in the stink and haggle your way through it. Here's a scandal the history books tried to wash away. Public bathhouses were shut down not because they were dirty, they weren't, but because people were having too much fun in them. And when people have fun without clothes, someone in power gets nervous. Especially in the 1200s, when joy was suspicious, skin was dangerous, and a good time could be mistaken for a sin. So they closed the baths. Not with fire. Not with plague. But with morality. And a very shaky excuse about vapors. Imagine a bathhouse in Paris or London, back when such things still existed. Warm rooms. Steam rising. Pools of clean water, heated by fires below. People soaking, chatting, laughing, scrubbing years of city life off their skin. Men, women, sometimes together, sometimes not, but always clean. Not spotless, perhaps, but clean enough to smell like herbs and sweat, not like a forgotten cellar. This wasn't luxury. It was normal. For centuries, people had washed like this. Romans built empires on it. Monks recommended it. Even kings went in, wrapped in towels like nervous penguins. And then, one day, someone in a robe with too many buttons decided it was all a trap. Too much pleasure, they said. Too much touching. Not that anyone was proving it. But the idea was enough. If people are relaxed, warm, and wet, they might start thinking for themselves. Or worse, enjoying it. So the bathhouses were condemned. Not because they spread disease. They didn't. They prevented it. But because they spread something far more dangerous, happiness. And in a world where suffering was next to godliness, happiness was practically heresy. The real irony? The same people who shut down the baths later blamed them for everything. The baths made people weak. They said. They opened the pores to evil air. They caused the plague. Never mind that the plague arrived after the baths were closed. Never mind that the streets, now full of unwashed bodies, became perfect breeding grounds for rats with travel plans. No. The baths were guilty. Because guilt needs a face. And a bathhouse, with its cheerful steam and lack of shame, was an easy target. Before the ban, bathhouses were social hubs. Like pubs, but with less ale and more scrubbing. You went to gossip. To meet friends. To escape the cold. Some even offered massages, with oils made from olives and thyme. Others had different rooms, hot, warm, cool. You could spend hours there, drifting in and out of sleep, listening to the quiet splash of water, the murmur of voices, the occasional snore from a man who'd had too much wine and too little shame. It was civilization at its simplest: warm water, clean skin, no pretense. But the authorities didn't see peace. They saw temptation. A woman with wet hair and a loose towel. That was a moral crisis. A man laughing in a pool? That was a threat to order. They didn't care that most people just wanted to be clean. They cared that they looked like they were enjoying it. And so, one by one, the bathhouses were sealed. Boards went up. Fires were doused. The water cooled. And Europe began its long, slow descent into the great stink. Some priests claimed that bathing was vanity. That to care about the body was to neglect the soul. Let the filth remain, they said, as a reminder of our sin. Which was a noble idea if you didn't have to sit next to them at dinner. Others said water carried disease through the skin, a theory so wild it should have come with a circus. But it spread faster than the truth. Soon, people were afraid to wash. Not because they were dirty. Because they were obedient. And obedience, in those days, smelled like old wool and regret. The few who still bathed did so in secret. A quick scrub behind a curtain. A dip in a river at dawn. A sponge with warm water, used quickly, quietly, like a forbidden prayer. And even then, they felt guilty. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt too good. Pleasure had become the enemy. Clean skin was suspicious. If you smelled fresh, people looked at you sideways. What are you hiding? Their eyes said, why do you care so much? In a world that worshipped suffering, cleanliness was practically a confession. And yet, the memory of the baths lingered. Old men would whisper about the steam rooms, the warmth, the way your muscles forgot their pain. They had water that bubbled like soup, one said. And a man would rub your back with a stone that wasn't sharp, but knew your bones. It sounded like heaven. Or madness. Or both. The young didn't believe them. How could such a place exist? In a world where the king hadn't washed in years, where the church feared soap, where the air in cities could knock a bird from the sky, who would allow cleanliness? But it had been real. And its loss wasn't just about dirt. It was about comfort. About dignity. About the simple idea that a human being might deserve to feel light, just once in a while. Not blessed. Not saved. Just clean. But that was too simple. Too human. And in a time when power came from control, the bathhouse was a threat. Because you can't rule someone who feels good in their skin. So they closed them. Not with war. Not with fire. But with words. With fear. With the quiet, steady voice of someone who'd rather see you suffer than smile. And Europe, slowly, forgot how to wash. Not because it couldn't, but because it was told it shouldn't. And when you stop washing, not out of laziness, but out of belief, that's when the real filth begins, not on the skin, but in the mind. Years later, when the plague came, they blamed the air. The stars. The Jews. The cats. But never the real enemy, the silence where the baths used to be. The empty rooms. The cold pipes. The absence of steam rising into the night. Because a clean people might have survived. But a scared, stinking, obedient people? They were easy to lose. And as the wind blew through the boarded up doors, and the dust settled on the dry tiles, the bathhouses stood like tombs. Not for the dead, but for an idea. That joy, warmth, and clean skin were not sins. That sometimes, the most rebellious thing a person can do is simply take a bath. And somewhere, deep in the memory of Europe, the steam still rises. Quiet. Warm. Impossible to hold. But impossible to forget. Here's a secret the portraits never show. The most important skill among nobles wasn't swordplay, horsemanship, or knowing which fork to use when forks hadn't been invented yet. It was breathing through the mouth while looking like you'd never heard of lungs. A nobleman's true talent wasn't in ruling. It was in endurance, specifically, the ability to stand in a room full of stewed cabbage, old wine, and the quiet decay of human underarms, and still appear divine. It was an art. A silent, wheezing art. And it was taught from childhood. Imagine a young lord, no older than 10, being trained in the royal chambers. Not in reading. Not in prayer. But in presence. Head high, the tutor would say. Back straight. Smile slightly. And for God's sake, don't sniff. Because sniffing was weakness. Sniffing meant you noticed. And noticing the air was a peasant habit. A noble didn't smell the world. He imposed on it. So the boy learned to breathe shallowly, through his mouth, like a fish that had been dragged onto land but refused to admit it. If he gagged, he was punished. Not for being sick, For being rude. The real test came at banquets. Great halls packed with lords, ladies, servants, dogs, and whatever was left of last week's boar. The air wasn't just thick. It was layered. At floor level, damp rushes, trampled by boots, soaked in ale, home to beetles and forgotten bones. Mid-air, the warm cloud of bodies, wool, and sweat that had been building since morning. And above, near the rafters, the lingering ghost of smoke, incense, and something that might have been perfume, or might have been a small animal on fire. To walk into that hall was to enter a living stew. To dine in it was to commit to the lie. And the lie was this: everything is fine. The king sits at the head, crowned, velvet draped, smiling. He does not wrinkle his nose. He does not fan himself. He does not, under any circumstances, suggest opening a window. That would be admitting defeat. Instead, he takes slow, shallow breaths, like a man sleeping with a cat on his chest. His eyes stay calm. His voice stays steady. He raises a goblet. He laughs at a joke. And all the while, his body is screaming air. Clean air. Anything. But his face? His face is a masterpiece of denial. Ladies were even better at it. They had more practice. A noble woman could stand next to a man whose breath could peel varnish, smile, compliment his hat, and mentally compose a poem about distant meadows, all without inhaling deeply enough to trigger a cough. Their secret? The pomander. That little metal ball on a chain, dangling from the wrist, filled with dried herbs, spices, and sometimes a drop of something vaguely citrus. It wasn't jewelry. It was a life support system. She'd lift it to her nose, not too obviously, like she was checking the time, and take a quick, discreet whiff of cloves and regret. Then back to the conversation. "How is your mother?" she'd ask, while her soul fled the room. Some nobles developed techniques. One duke was said to breathe only during thunderclaps, when the noise covered any snuffling. Another blinked 3 times before inhaling, a signal to his body to brace. A countess in Burgundy trained her dog to sit near her during feasts, not for comfort, but because the animal's fur absorbed the worst of the smell, acting as a furry filter. When the dog died, she mourned less the pet and more the fresh air it had once provided. And then there were the clothes. Layers upon layers. Velvet, wool, fur, linen, all trapping heat, sweat, and scent like a blanket over a fire. A noble didn't just wear a tunic. He wore history. The same garment, worn for weeks, absorbing meals, emotions, and the occasional spill. Washing it? Out of the question. It would lose its character, its authority. Instead, they'd air it, hang it outside for an hour, slap it a few times, and call it clean. The smell wasn't dirt. It was tradition. And tradition, like mildew, was meant to linger. The worst was winter. No open windows. No breeze. Just fire, bodies, and the slow build-up of breath that had been recycled too many times. One monk recorded a feast where 3 guests fainted not from wine, but from the air itself. They were carried out, revived with vinegar, and brought back in, because leaving early was worse than breathing poison. Etiquette was stronger than lungs. And yet, they called this civilization. This was refinement. This was culture. To sit through a meal where the main dish and the host competed for who reaped more, and to do it with grace, that was nobility. That was power. A peasant might wash, but he couldn't endure. A knight might fight, but he couldn't suffer silently. Only the aristocracy could sit still, smile, and slowly suffocate in the name of dignity. They didn't complain. They didn't even whisper. To admit the air was bad was to admit you were common. That you hadn't risen above the body. That you still needed comfort. And a true noble didn't need comfort. He needed respect. Even if it killed him. Slowly. Quietly. With excellent posture. Children were trained early. Don't wrinkle your nose, mothers would say. It's unbecoming. If you must breathe, do it through your mouth, and never, ever sigh. They learned to associate fresh air with chaos. A breeze meant disorder. An open window meant anarchy. The perfect room was sealed, warm, and thick with the scent of people who had been there too long. That was home. That was safety. And when they traveled, that was the real test. Carriages with no windows. Tents that smelled of damp leather and old men. Inns where the mattress was alive. Yet still, the nobleman stepped out, straightened his coat, and declared, "Charming." Not because it was, but because saying otherwise would mean admitting he felt something. And feeling was for poets. For beggars. For people who hadn't spent years learning how not to. So the next time you take a deep breath and think nothing of it, remember the lords and ladies of old. They didn't have that luxury. They had duty. The duty to stand in a world that stank and pretend it was perfume. To smile at a man whose breath could wilt flowers and say, "You're looking well." To survive not by strength, not by wisdom, but by the quiet, heroic act of not breathing too deeply. And as the candles burned low and the hall emptied, and the last noble finally slipped behind a curtain to gasp like a fish on land, the truth returned. Not in words. Not in laws. But in a single, shuddering breath of air that tasted, at last, like something close to free. Here's the cruelest joke history ever played. When the Black Death arrived, people blamed the air. Not the rats. Not the fleas. Not the fact that everyone had been living in a pile of their own leftovers for centuries. No, they blamed bad air. Miasma, they called it. A poisonous fog of rotten sin that floated through the streets, looking for weak lungs. And so, they did what any sensible medieval person would do, they made the air even worse. They burned herbs. They waved cloth soaked in vinegar. They shut the windows tighter than ever, as if God had sent a plague and the best defense was suffocation. Doctors wore masks shaped like bird beaks, stuffed with lavender, mint, and things they hoped would help. They looked like nightmares with PhDs. And they walked through villages, swinging censers, muttering prayers, and spreading more smoke, and not to cure the sick, but to drown out the smell of death. Which, ironically, only made the air more poisonous. But at least it smelled expensive. The truth? The air wasn't the killer. It was just the messenger. The real problem wasn't what they breathed in. It was what they were. A continent of people who hadn't washed properly in generations. Who lived in houses where the floor was a mix of mud, waste, and last Tuesday's soup? Who shared beds, clothes, and breath like it was normal? And it was normal. That was the tragedy. The filth wasn't an accident. It was routine. A way of life built on fear, faith, and the quiet belief that suffering was holy. And then, the plague came. And for the first time in centuries, something was worse than the smell. It moved fast. Silent. Relentless. One day, a man was arguing over a chicken. The next, he was a sack of fever and blackened skin. Bodies piled up. Not in graves. In streets. In doorways. In the corners of churches where the incense had finally given up. And the smell? It wasn't just decay. It was change. A new stench, deeper than the old ones. The smell of a world that had stopped pretending. But here's the strange thing, as the death toll rose, the air began to improve. Not because people were cleaner. Because there were fewer of them. Fewer bodies. Fewer feasts. Fewer lords holding their breath at banquets. The streets were quieter. The markets half empty. The castles cold. And in that silence, something rare happened. The wind could finally move. No more crowds. No more stewed cabbage. No more chamber pots tipping into moats like it was a royal tradition. Just wind. Real, open, clean wind. Blowing through empty halls, across abandoned fields, past houses with doors left open. For the first time in memory, you could walk outside and not feel like you were swallowing a blanket. You could breathe. Deeply. Without thinking. Without punishment. And no one celebrated. They were too afraid. Too broken. But somewhere, deep in the lungs of Europe, a reflex returned. The simple act of filling your chest with air that didn't taste like regret. Children who survived grew up knowing less fear, less ritual, less stench. They didn't know it then, but they were the first to live in a world where clean air wasn't a sin. The church blamed sin. The kings blamed foreigners. The doctors blamed the stars. But the rats, quiet and efficient, knew the truth. They hadn't brought the plague. They'd just moved in. The house was already ready. Warm. Crowded. Full of food and filth. A perfect home. And when the humans started dying, the rats didn't cheer. They just kept eating. And living. And being, frankly, more sensible than anyone else. After the worst had passed, people came back. Slowly. Cautiously. They rebuilt. They replanted. They even, in some places, started washing again. Not because they suddenly loved water, but because the old rules had broken. The idea that dirt was holy? That had died with the rest. If God had wanted them to suffer, why save some and not others? Maybe, just maybe, he preferred clean sheets. Bathhouses didn't return overnight. But the fear of them faded. The idea that joy was dangerous. Less convincing when half your family was gone. And so, quietly, the world began to change. Not with a revolution. Not with a sermon. But with a breath. A deep one. The kind that fills your chest and doesn't burn. They didn't realize it then, but the plague had done something no king, no pope, no poet ever could. It made space. Space for air. For silence. For the simple truth that a person shouldn't have to hold their breath just to be polite. And as the years passed, the stories of the great stink began to fade. Not because they weren't true, but because they became unbelievable. Parents would tell their children about a time when no one washed, when windows stayed shut, when the smell of a castle was its best defense. And the children would laugh. That's not real, they'd say. No one could live like that. And the parents would smile. Not to argue, but because they knew some truths are too strange to survive memory. So the Middle Ages ended not with a bang, not with a discovery, but with a sneeze. A final, wet, desperate sneeze, and then, at last, a long, slow breath of air that didn't kill you. And somewhere, in a field far from any castle, a single flower grew. No one saw it. No one praised it. But it was there. Small. Quiet. Alive. And for the first time in a long time, the wind carried its scent, not far, not loud, but clear. Not of power. Not of prayer. Not of rot. Just of something green. Something new. And something, at last, almost sweet.